Hi there. Welcome, welcome. My name is Lynn Dome. I'm Women in Cybersecurity Executive Director. We often go by our acronym WiCyS, WICYS, and we pronounce it WeSys, like we sisters, because that's exactly what we are. We are a cyber sisterhood. So our mission is to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity. And we're a community comprised of women, men, allies, and advocates that all have a strong mission and passion to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity. We have over 5,700 members with representation in over 70 countries. We also have 49 professional affiliates, which are little mini WiCyS organizations. They're all throughout Africa, Australia, Canada, France, India, Pakistan, the UK, and throughout the United States. And then in addition to that, we have specialty affiliates like WiCyS Artificial Intelligence, WiCyS Cloud Security, WiCyS Critical Infrastructure. We have WiCyS BISO, WiCyS LGBTQ plus Pride, WiCyS Neurodiversity, WiCyS Military, and so many others. And on top of that, we also have over 170 student chapters. But because our mission is to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity, we do so by creating opportunities. So we have skill development training programs. We have an online member forum where all our members can network and connect. We have newsletters and webinar series, such as the one today brought to us with our strategic partner, AWS. We also offer scholarship grants and awards, not only to our conference, which will be in 2023, it will be March 16th through the 18th in Denver, Colorado, but we also offer scholarship grants and awards to other conferences as well. Our Cyber Talent Emergency Fund is available for student members that have a financial emergency, like their car breaks down, or they can't afford their rent, or they have a medical expense, an unexpected expense. They could receive up to $599 within 48 hours of requesting those funding opportunities. We have speaking and media opportunities so our members can be what others can see. And our Job Board Plus Plus is available for strategic partners like AWS to post their jobs year round and also recruit from the Job Board Plus Plus 24/7 year round opportunities. They have accessibility and availability to our resume portal there. We have internship programs, apprenticeship programs. We participate in market research. We have leadership summits, leadership series, leadership workshops. We have a speakers bureau, which we're going to be relaunching in next year in the spring. And then we also have a mentor-mentee program. Right now we have 850 mentees in the program and 250 mentors. And we designed and developed a curriculum to upskill and uplevel women no matter where they're at in their careers, preparing them for the next level of advancement. We have all that and more if you check out our website, WiCyS.org, WICYS.org. But we owe all that thanks to our strategic partners, AWS, that brings us our webinar here today, Bloomberg, Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, Cisco, Fortinet, Google, Intel, Lockheed Martin, Meta, Microsoft Optum, Sandia National Labs, SentinelOnes, and you see we have also tier 2 and tier 3 partners as well. So today's your opportunity to ask questions. We have the lovely Rebecca here from AWS, and she will be presenting on detecting MITRE attacks with AWS. And so here's your opportunity to ask those questions, and Rebecca will be answering them live. And if you haven't done so already, please kindly subscribe to the WiCyS newsletter. That's where you're going to stay up to date on all the latest and greatest opportunities. We roll out programs like crazy. And so we are able to notify all our 22,000 subscribers plus some through our newsletter. So please go to the website and subscribe. So I'm going to end slides here. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic on over to Rebecca and she'll take it away.
Hey there, everyone. Really nice to be here with WiCyS. I've been a member for quite a while now, and I've wanted to talk at one of these events for a super long time, so it's really excellent to be here. So as Lynn said, I'm going to be talking about detecting MITRE attacks using AWS. Just a little bit about myself before we get started. So I'm a security consultant. So that means I'm helping a lot of AWS's customers implement security tooling using AWS services, meeting their security requirements. I've recently moved across to AWS's aerospace and satellite team. So I'm getting to grips with that sector, working out what their security challenges are and helping them meet them. My background is actually security architecture. So I've done some work with the UK central government. So if any of you have been through border security or filled in the COVID passenger locator form, then you will have used a piece of technology that I've helped to secure, which is kind of cool. So a couple of years ago, I did a master's in information security, and my dissertation or thesis topic was the one I'm talking to you about today: detecting MITRE attacks using AWS. Okay, so what's the talk about? So what I want to try and get across is, as well as talking through some examples of how to use AWS tools to actually detect some of the techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I also want to kind of talk through an approach that I've used with security operations centers in the wild to actually help them get started with a cloud environment, and AWS is the one we're talking about here today. So often I kind of come across customers where, you've got your separate engineering team or your kind of business facing functionality builders team, and then you've got your information assurance security team, and they often don't talk to each other, or the engineers are super excited about AWS and they want to get going, but the security team are totally overwhelmed because they're busy already trying to secure the existing environment, maybe on premise or something like that, and to have to handle a whole new environment that they don't know anything about, totally overwhelming. So hopefully the approach that I'm going to talk through today might give you some ideas on how to get people enthused or kind of gradually introduce them to cloud without overwhelming them. So I'll just kick off. So I'm not sure who's on the call today, and maybe some of you have come across threat modeling in security before, but in case you haven't, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a threat model. So I thought it's just worth me going through what threat modeling is, just to make sure we're kind of all on a base level understanding. So threat model breaks down into 3 simple questions. When you're doing a threat model, you need to know, well, what are we building? What system is it? What data is there? What business function does it serve? The second thing is, okay, what can go wrong? So this is where your threat models come in, and this is where MITRE is one example of a list of things that can go wrong. I've had a question come in, so I'm going to answer all the questions at the end, but let me just see if I can answer this one. Yes, I'm paraphrasing. So when I get to the slide on what is the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I will talk through this. I'm just kind of shortening it so it's easier to understand. But when I got a slide on what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is, so I'll answer that question then. So second thing, what can go wrong? So you need a list of things that hackers can do, or a list of maybe your data is going to be stolen, or maybe it's going to be encrypted. So you need to collect together a list of things that can go wrong. And then once you have that list, you can throw them at the system that you're building and say, what are we going to do about it? And that is your threat model. So it's a process of working out what can go wrong, what you're going to do about it on the system that you're building. Okay, so hopefully this will start to answer the question, what is the MITRE ATT&CK framework? It's essentially, it's a matrix of different techniques and tactics that are carried out by real world hackers in the wild. So let me show you, let me share my screen for you. So this is the MITRE ATT&CK website. So if you want to look at the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, then you can navigate to the mitre.org webpage, and you'll basically be presented with this massive matrix of things. So when we talk about a tactic, that is this row along the top. So these are titles for tactics that an attacker might take to carry out a cyber attack. And they loosely follow a process that we've seen in the wild that hackers take. So on the left-hand side, we start with reconnaissance, and this is all about gathering information about the target. So it might either be the people who work at the organization. Are they vulnerable? Like, could we give them a USB stick in the car park or something? Or it might just be something more technical. They might be scanning a network. They might be working out what ports are open. what protocols run there. So that's kind of the first stage of a cyber attack. And then all the tactics in the middle are to do with how they propagate through a system. So how do they get credentials? How do they escalate their privileges? So if they get hold of an account, can they then, maybe it's just a normal user account, can they make that an admin? So it's all about different techniques to propagate themselves through a technical system. And then at the end is a set of tactics to actually carry out what they intended to do. So this is all around, okay, maybe they wanted to encrypt the data and make it unavailable to you and ask you for some money to get it back. That was their tactic. Or maybe they want to exfiltrate the data. So they want to actually steal it, maybe sell it on and do something else with it. If you're just getting to grips with the process or the tactics that a cyber attacker can take, then a much simpler way of learning and understanding about this is to have a look at the NCSC Cyber Chilcane. So I'm showing that page for you now. And if you scroll down to the stages of an attack section on this page, the link is in the slides, which we'll be sharing, then it breaks it down into 4 steps. So you don't need to handle 14 different tactics like you do in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. You can just get to grips with the 4, and we've kind of already talked through these already. So survey, investigate your target, find out what information is out there that will help you build or identify vulnerabilities. Delivery, so the second stage is to write your exploit or write the actual piece of malware and actually deliver it to the network. Breach, so again, this will be you've delivered your exploit and now you're in the system. You've gained some kind of unauthorized access on an IT system. And then lastly, the effect. So you've managed to exfiltrate the data, you've managed to encrypt it, you've managed to bring down a server so the website doesn't work anymore, etc., etc. They're just some examples. Okay, so if I just go back to the slides. So we talked about those 14 tactics. Underneath those 14 columns is a set of techniques that relate to that tactic. So these are now getting right into the weeds of the detail of that tactic. So they're things that we've seen, that might have seen in the wild by real live cyber groups. So if you dig into their website a little bit, you will see that for each technique, so these are the boxes under each of the columns, that will tell you some examples of hacker groups that have conducted a particular type of attack on a particular IT system. So you can start to look for some real examples of hackers who have managed to carry out a particular technique, and maybe you're using the same technology that they list there. I guess what the last thing to say here is, the set of matrices is quite extensive. It covers a broad range of technologies. So there's matrices there for Windows, Linux, Mac, and for the cloud. I would say when you're thinking about using the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I would not limit yourself to just one, because there might be techniques that span a different framework. So, for example, maybe you're using a cloud platform, and there is a matrix for cloud. You're probably installing servers on there, so you may be spinning up virtual machines that are Windows or Linux based, and so you probably want to use the Windows and Linux one as well as the cloud one. So just be mindful that there's more than one, and you can use as many or as little as you like. Okay, so yeah, I want to get to how you actually start to take some of these techniques and detect them using AWS. But before that, there's a couple of things that you need to work out. So the first thing to say is you need to choose your threat model. So we're talking about MITRE today, so that those matrices that I just showed you, they are a threat model. There are others, so I've listed a few here: Stride, the OWASP Top 10, the High Trust Threat Catalog. When you look at all of these, they are basically lists of different techniques, again, that cyber attackers can take. Now, all of them are slightly different and have benefits depending on the type of system or the goal that you're trying to achieve. So, for example, Stride. So if you just look that up on Google, because there's lots of resources about what Stride actually is. I've found Stride to be super useful when your outcome is to increase collaboration between security engineers and business function engineers. So, maybe they're not talking to each other right now and they're not on the same page. Like Stride is a gamified version of threat modeling. You get a card deck and you play a game. And it's just a super nice way of bringing everyone together in a fun environment to try and design some security controls. And it's also very specific towards web applications. So if you've got new web applications being built and you want to bring together security and your technical teams, then Stride is a great choice. So the other prerequisites are, so as you've seen that, the matrix is massive. So when I've used this before, we've not tried to do this on every single system. And with any threat modeling technique, you need to pick one system that has a design. So how do you pick your system? I mean, there's different ways. So I would recommend either picking the one that's going to be migrated to AWS or cloud first, or decide to do this on maybe it's the system with your most sensitive data in, or maybe it's the one where you think, oh, we've not got great security controls, or we've not had great security engagement on that one, so we'll do a threat model on that particular app. So it is up to you, but again, just pick one, because I think often when security teams and security operations centers are tasked with, okay, can you build some logging and monitoring around this new platform, it's just overwhelming. So just pick one and you can move forward. What you'll find is, when we get to the examples, is that lots of the mechanisms for detecting these are the same. And so once you've done it for one, it will absolutely replicate and scale to all of your other systems. So you're not going to end up kind of having to do it 100 different times. And the third thing to do before you get started is to pick a technique that are most relevant to you. So first thing, pick a column in that matrix that I showed you that's either most interesting or maybe your business are most worried about. So let me so here's all of the tactics along the top here. So that's those column headings that we had a look at just a minute ago. And what I've seen organizations do is, okay, they're really, really worried about exfiltration. That's the one thing that they really want to be able to detect if an attacker has managed to actually start copying and pasting data out of their environment, or literally moving databases to another environment. And so they focus their attention on the techniques that sit under that column. You might decide, okay, no, we want to go in order of the cyber kill chain, and so you start at the beginning with one of these, initial access or resource development ones. It's really up to you. Again, the most important thing is that you just pick one and focus on the techniques underneath that column. So yeah, we've talked about that. I think so. Once you've picked your column, so let's say that we're picking exfiltration. Underneath exfiltration, there will be a whole bunch of techniques, specific techniques. So this, you're now taking one column and looking it up and down vertically. So to pick the techniques, not all of them are going to be relevant to your particular system. So you need to discount the ones that don't make any sense. And then what you might want to do is have a look through your incident information that you've collected on previous attacks. So you might have seen some examples of defacement. So maybe someone's managed to get onto one of your websites and change the content on there, put a picture on there that you didn't want, or something like that. There will be a matching technique in one of the columns. And so I would suggest that you pick that one, as your security team is familiar with how that works and what kind of activities an attacker might have already taken. The other thing is, so you might subscribe to other threat intelligence feeds. So maybe like FireEye or CrowdStrike or something, you're paying for a threat intelligence report to be provided to you. I would suggest potentially picking some of the fashionable tactics and techniques that are going on in the wild and using one of those to kind of get you going with the techniques. Why MITRE? So I've kind of talked about this already. they've got a really wide set of techniques across lots of different technologies. So if you're looking for a holistic approach across your infrastructure stack set, then I think MITRE is the way to go. Stride, we talked about web application focused. What I really like about MITRE is, like I've said, it gives you that information about real-world attackers. So where this has been so useful is if you're trying to get funding or you're trying to get resources to work on this threat modeling exercise, if you start to talk about, well, we know that hacker group XYZ are conducting these types of attacks against this technology that we have, and we want to be able to implement controls against it, that just gives you so much more credibility in terms of business cases for resources and money. So being able to use that intelligence from this particular matrix is super useful. I'll also signpost you to, so when you're looking at implementing controls to detect the techniques that are in the matrix, there's a couple of open source resources where some of these rules have already been written. So you can, if you want to take the matrix and say, yep, we've implemented this tool which mitigates all of these techniques, then those resources are available. I'll show you those as we go through. All right. Okay, so I'm going to get to the actual, we're going to start having a go at using some native services to detect some of these things now. So on this slide, and I hope you can see it is quite small, but I'll talk you through it, is an example architecture. So what we've got here is a web app in AWS using some serverless technology. So serverless technology essentially means you don't have any virtual machines, you don't have any servers that you look after as a customer. AWS is doing that for you behind the scenes. All you're doing is managing the services that sit on top of those servers. So what you're seeing here at the top, we have some users, and they are essentially logging in via a service called Amazon Cognito to a website. So the website is built out of, we've got 4 different components there on the right-hand side. The first is something called an S3 bucket. So this is just storing documents. It's an object storage data store. And all that's in there is the static content of your website. So the content that doesn't change is just stored in HTML files in that S3 bucket. Then you have the actual kind of logic of your website. So when you go to the URL, when the users log in, they will be calling an API. So number 4 on there is the actual API that the users will be interacting with. Then we have the code. So with most websites, there's some kind of dynamic aspect to it. So, maybe they're entering data into some fields, and that data needs to be entered into a database. So all of that dynamic activity sits in our Lambda function there, and then that is the code. And we have a database. So in this particular example, we've got a website with a database. And with this, so the users here, they're entering maybe some of their personal data into the website so that we can, I don't know, provide them with a visa or some kind of passport application. If there's anyone out there that just wants to clarify anything about the architecture here, just drop a question in the question box, because I want to make sure that kind of makes sense to everyone before I move on. Okay, so we have our first thing in the threat model, which is our application. What are we building? We're building a public-facing website. Awesome. Now, it's helpful to call out what assets you're protecting here, because when you're asking your security team to design detection mechanisms, if they don't know what it is that they're protecting, it kind of loses a bit of meaning, and I think people can get a bit lost in what's the point. So defining your assets, super important, just to focus everyone's attention on what exactly we're trying to protect here. Oh, sure, yeah, I got a question about explaining Lambda functions. So a Lambda in AWS is a piece of code. It's just a piece of code. So normally, it's a serverless technology, so you don't need to spin up a server and install your code on the server and have it run on there. The Lambda just allows you to write the code, and then you can trigger that code from another AWS service. I hope that makes sense. So In terms of assets for this particular architecture, we have user credentials. So for example, email addresses, passwords people are using to log into the website. And then we've got user credentials for AWS itself. So if I just go back to the architecture here, all of those services, so the Lambda function, that's our Python code that's kind of doing the logic of the website, our API gateway, our S3 bucket, that's all running in AWS in an AWS account. So that account has some root credentials that you log in with, and so we need to think about those credentials as well. It's not just the credentials of the users logging into the website, it's the users of the platform itself that the website sits on. We need to be thinking about, okay, what else do we need to protect? So static web content is so anything that's in that S3 bucket we want to protect. So we don't want anybody being able to get into that S3 bucket and deface or modify that static content, because that could impact our reputation as an organization, depending on what they add or delete from there. Similarly, the code in the Lambda function, that controls what happens with the data that gets uploaded. So we do not want anybody to impact the integrity of the code in that Lambda function. If they were able to change that code, they could do anything. They could redirect the data that the users are uploading to a different database. They could connect to a different network from there. So the integrity of that code in the Lambda is super important. And then finally, this is the one that most people think about. So, if you're asked to have a look at assets of a web app, everyone's going to be concerned about that application data. That is arguably one of the most important things that we need to protect. In the wild, this is the secret source that the hackers are after. This is the stuff they want to get in and encrypt or delete or steal. So again, that's probably the most common asset that people are familiar with. All right, so we have our architecture. We have an idea about what data is in that architecture and what it is we want to actually protect. Now, okay, so we're sat with our security team, and we're asking them to design some ways to detect some malicious activity or some unauthorized access on this system. So they're going to need to know something about AWS services that can detect attacks. And that is a prerequisite for this kind of model. So I think if you're thinking about doing this, then I would suggest running some AWS training on some of the basic security services, just so that when you're doing this exercise, you've got some knowledge of some of the tools that can help you answer the questions. So I'm going to very briefly, so there's 7 on here. I don't want to spend loads of time on it. I'm going to very briefly go through the 7 of these, and I will come back to them again later on. So if you've not quite understood, don't worry. I will be covering off these later when we go through the actual examples. All right, so CloudTrail, AWS CloudTrail, it's a native logging capability. So what can you do? If I go back to our architecture diagram, every single one of those services on there will write a log to CloudTrail. So it will basically say, I'm Amazon S3, I connected to API gateway at this time on this day, and it was triggered by this service. So it's literally a list of every single action by a user or a service on the platform. Every service in AWS is API based, so any API activity on the platform will be logged into CloudTrail. CloudWatch metrics, so it's another logging mechanism. So any service in AWS where you can collect performance data, so maybe you want to know how many calls have been made to your API, or how many people have actually visited the URL that's attached to your API, and you can collect information about the performance of your Lambda function, how long did your piece of code actually run for, when did it run, and there's all sorts of pre-canned metrics that are available in CloudWatch metrics. VPC flow logs. So here is your network activity. So if you want to know what IP address has connected to what endpoint, so what IP address has connected to what port, what protocol, and in which direction. So is it inbound or outbound? Then your VPC flow logs are the ones to go. So if you're familiar with NetFlow, they're very similar to that kind of log. AWS config. So this one is about detecting misconfigurations in your AWS environment. So if you have accidentally, if you've not turned on logging, or if somebody has maliciously deactivated logging as part of a defense evasion, then AWS config will be able to tell you that logging is no longer on, or encryption is no longer on, or any number of different configuration settings for each of the services. A classic one that you hear about all the time is around S3 buckets being made public. So that means that anybody on the internet can get into your S3 bucket and change or delete the content. AWS config is the service that will help you detect if that's happening. Guard duty. So if any of you are familiar with intrusion detection systems, guard duty is very similar to that. So it's taking logging information from your account. Specifically, it's looking at your DNS logs, your CloudTrail, and your VPC logs. It's analyzing those. It's got some inbuilt threat intelligence, and it will be able to identify malicious activity in your account automatically. I will be doing a demo of this later, so you'll see some of the things that it can, some of the examples of things that it can detect. And some of those things are directly in line with some of the techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So it's kind of like a super handy tool for ticking off lots of the techniques. Talk very briefly about boundary services. So specifically, I'll be mentioning our web application firewall. So again, if we're looking at attackers carrying out things in the OWASP top 10, so maybe they're doing some kind of SQL injection or a cross-site scripting attack, one of the attacks listed in the OWASP top 10, and AWS WAF is the service that will be able to detect and prevent them from using that particular exploit. And then lastly, Amazon Inspector is a vulnerability management service. So it's all about detecting vulnerabilities in code or in operating systems. So if you want to know, oh, this particular server has all of these CVEs, or this particular bit of code has got all of these vulnerabilities, then Amazon Inspector is the tool to help you with that. That's a lot of information. I'd probably completely brain dump that all on you again, and we'll be covering these off again in a bit more detail in a minute. If you've got any immediate questions about some of those, then just drop them in. I'm happy to answer those now before I move on. All right, so let's kick off with an example. So this example is looking at, so maybe if I share my screen again for you. So I'm looking at, so my organization has decided to look at the initial access tactic, and we're going to pick the valid account technique. So we're worried about an attacker gaining initial access to our platform through some kind of account that's already available on the platform. So if I come back to the slide deck, we have, okay, so we need to identify what are the valid accounts, what user credentials could actually be used by an attacker to do something malicious in our IT system. So on the right hand side is our architecture, just to remind you of the components that we've got there with our web app. And on the left are a list of different types of credentials an attacker could get hold of to start doing nefarious things in here. So the root account we talked about. So, with every AWS environment, you get an account, and every AWS account has got a root account that can be used to log in with. So if an attacker gets hold of that, they can come in, they have the keys to the kingdom at that point. They can then, unless you've implemented some controls to prevent that, they could delete that code, they could delete our S3 bucket, they could delete and copy the database wherever they like. So that root account is really important that we protect that. The next two So within AWS, when you need to give permissions to people to deploy services. So whoever's job it is to spin up that database or to build to write the code and deploy it in the environment, they need users and roles to be able to carry out that activity. And so if an attacker's able to get hold of those, again, they will have a degree of elevated access to the platform, and they could potentially, again, delete the database or copy the data. So it's quite similar to that root account. And then finally, we've got our Cognito user. So again, if the other way into the platform would be to obtain some usernames and passwords of the users themselves who are logging into the database. Right, so we have our security team in the room. They understand the architecture. We've picked our technique and our tactic, and now we're trying to, and we've kind of scoped it a little bit. So we've worked out what a valid account actually is. Once we know what a valid account is, we can start to say, okay, well, what would we look for? Like, if one of these accounts was compromised, how would we know? What would we actually need to look for? So there's 3 examples here. You might well be able to think of some more, and if you can, and drop them in the chat. I'd be super interested to hear what your thoughts are. So an example here might be the root account logging in. So ideally, nobody logs in with that root account. So an indicator of compromise might be simply that root account has been used. So that sounds like something we might be able to detect. The other things might be, okay, our AWS administrators, or they don't log in, after 7 p.m. It's very rare for one of them to be ever on the platform between 7 p.m. and maybe like 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning. So if you see any activity of that user logging in at an unusual time, we can probably have a look, and that might be an indicator that something's happening that we don't want. And then finally, so kind of similar in that, okay, well, our administrators, they don't actually ever need to access that database. They're responsible for writing the Lambda code. They don't need any access to the database. So we might be able to detect if a user is accessing things that they don't normally access to. Oh yeah, okay, so some ideas coming in now. Brute forcing logs against a set of credentials might be a potential. Yep, I like that one. So, yep, definitely if a user's put a weak password on or something, then an attacker might be able to brute force that and gain unauthorized access. In fact, using any of these, so it could be one of the users accessing the website, or it could be that trying to use the credentials of that root account. I think there's a question about sharing slides. I'm pretty sure this is being recorded. I'm not sure about the slides. I'm happy to share them. I'll reach out to Lynn to see if we can get them shared as well after. Okay, so we now have a list of things that we want to look for that might indicate a compromise of these valid accounts. So remember, we've got to try and keep our focus on the particular technique that we're looking at. How are we going to detect them? So I've listed a couple of the services that we talked about earlier that are going to help us here. Now, the first one is CloudTrail and CloudTrail Lake. So I didn't mention CloudTrail Lake. All that really is it's a data lake of all of your logs. So right now, when you collect CloudTrail logs, you get a whole bunch of JSON files. I'll show you what one of those looks like in a minute. So I have a picture of one. Yeah, so here's a picture of a CloudTrail log. That in its raw form is not that easy to search. And so CloudTrail Lake allows you to ingest all of these logs into somewhere where you can run SQL queries across the data in it. So using that lake and the SQL language over the top just allows you to search across these a little bit easier. And then the second one is guard duty. So let me start with CloudTrail. So that's just a picture of how CloudTrail works. So we've got our original architecture, we've got our users, we've got our static content, we've got our code, we've got our database and our mechanism for authenticating users. Each of those services will send information to CloudTrail. So we will know that XYZ user has logged in at a specific time and done a specific thing. And here's an example. So every CloudTrail log is just a set of key pairs, basically. So you've got a key and a key value attached to it. The items in orange are the ones that are interesting for us here. So we've got a user identity of type root. What are they doing? Okay, the event name or their console login. So we know they've logged into the console, and that's the event type is similar. So we now have a log that can tell us that the root account has logged in. And you could configure an event in AWS to look for those settings and set up an alert, which will tell you the root account's been logged in. And, you know, once you've implemented that, that will help your security team investigate. Now, we also mentioned guard duty. So guard duty has some rules in there to detect this type of behavior. And what you're seeing there is a screenshot of guard duty and a couple of findings there that are essentially saying the same thing, in that the root credential has been used. And so again, you could just have your security team turn on guard duty. It's very, very super quick to turn on, just a couple of clicks in the console and guard duty will be running for you. And it will help you detect some of this malicious activity. I've got a link there at the bottom. So someone has done a mapping of all of the things that guard duty can do with respect to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So if you want to know which of the techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework guard duty can detect, it's all there in that GitHub repository. So it's a super useful place to go and look for detection capability. I'll just quickly show you guard duty in the console because I can show you some more of the actual findings. So I'm in the AWS console right now. The first thing to do is, so we'll go to guard duty. And in the center here, you basically get a dashboard of, so what I've done here is I've imported a whole bunch of sample findings. So these are not real, they're just here to show you the breadth of things that guard duty can actually detect. Now, we're worried about, one of the things we're worried about is unusual behavior of a particular user. So one of the ones that I've got here is around unusual activity on an S3 bucket. So if we have an admin or some other user fishing around our S3 buckets when they wouldn't normally, or trying to download data from them where they wouldn't, then guard duty will be able to detect that for you. So if we just click on that finding, and if you've got a chance to read the text there, it's basically saying this finding informs you that the IAM entity, so our valid account, is making API calls that involve this particular S3 bucket and that differ from the established baseline. So the one thing that guard duty is able to do is baseline normal activity on the account. And so using machine learning, it will baseline the normal activity, and then it's able to identify anomalies from that baseline. If I go down to the bottom of this list of findings in guard duty, we've actually got some real ones. So these ones don't have any sample in the front of them. And I just show you some of these because one of the tactics in the MITRE ATT&CK framework is this defense evasion one. So this is all going to be about turning off logs and hiding the fact that anything nefarious has been done. And one of the interesting things here is that in this particular account, somebody has been able to disable our CloudTrail logging. And that would be a really strong indicator that somebody is trying to hide their tracks because they've turned off your logs. So I will just come back to the slide deck. Oh, yeah, so we've had another example of an indicator of compromise come in, account getting locked multiple times within a specific time frame. Yep, absolutely. So again, guard duty will detect multiple attempts to try and access a root account. So if somebody is using that mechanism and not getting the password right, then absolutely we want to be detecting that. That's great. Thank you for that. Right, so we've covered off guard duty. This is just for the slide, so if you've not got access to the AWS console, this is just the text from guard duty there if you want to have a look at some of the information that you get there in that tool. This is another example of CloudTrail log, so it captures the event time. So if you're looking for unusual timing, then you can use CloudTrail again to identify that. All right, so that's the first example. I hope that makes sense, and it's starting to kind of come clear about what the MITRE ATT&CK framework can do for you in terms of really drilling down into specific detection mechanisms for real attacks. So I'm just going to go through one more example because this is going to help showcase some of the other AWS services that can help do some detection for you. And so this one is from the execution tactic. And what we're doing is exploitation for client execution. Now, what that means is this is all about exploiting vulnerabilities. So an attacker has done some research. They know that you have some particular vulnerabilities either in your code, or I'm also extending the definition here a little bit. They also know that you might have misconfigured a particular AWS service. So I'll use the example of a public S3 bucket. They might have done some scanning on AWS and identified that this bucket here you've accidentally made it public somehow. So I would say that this example, detecting vulnerabilities or CVEs, detecting misconfiguration, and on top of that, we want to detect the actual attempt to exploit that vulnerability. So we want to know about vulnerabilities, but that's not necessarily, having a vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean it's definitely been exploited. So we still need mechanisms to actually work out, have they exploited it? Has anybody tried to use that vulnerability to gain unauthorized access to your system? So again, we'll go through the same process. We need some indicators of a vulnerability being actually exploited. So as a first step, we need to know what vulnerabilities and misconfigurations we actually have. And then a second, again, if you've got any more thoughts about what types of indicators might suggest that a vulnerability has been exploited, drop them in the chat. Super interested to hear about those. The second example that I'm going to use here is for most public-facing web apps, we would always recommend using a firewall to detect malicious attempts to exploit any vulnerabilities in your website code. And so an indicator of somebody attempting to exploit these vulnerabilities might be detected by your firewall. So hopefully you'll have some rules in there that are able to scan the packets that are coming over the network and detect the types of interactions that hackers are having with your web application. All right, so how do we detect these? We've got a few services here, so I'll very quickly go through these because I want to leave some time for some more questions at the end. How do we detect these? So we might want to use AWS Config or Security Hub. So again, both of these services are about detecting misconfigurations. They both have an extensive set of rules in them for detecting misconfigurations that may cause some kind of security incident in your account. Amazon Inspector. So again, we're interested in detecting vulnerabilities here. And so utilizing Amazon Inspector, you'll be able to scan your servers and the operating systems installed on those. You'll be able to scan if you're running containers and you have container images, then you'll be able to scan for vulnerabilities in those. And then any code that you're running on the platform as well, Inspector will automatically scan for that. And then finally, we mentioned it already, Web Application Firewall. So in AWS's WAF, you can turn on some of the basic rule sets that are managed by AWS, and one of those includes your OWASP top 10. So if an attacker is accessing your website and they're trying to do a SQL injection and you've got the OWASP top 10 rule set on your WAF, you will be able to see in the logs that an attempt to carry out an exploit of a vulnerability has been made. So just to wrap up, and then we'll leave some time for some questions at the end, is, so, this approach is not for everyone. It's, it's an approach, and I'd be super interested to hear whether it's something that you think would work in your organization, and if so, why, and also super interested to hear if it wouldn't work in your organization and why. It would just help me inform, what kind of scenarios this sort of thing would work in and which sort of scenarios it wouldn't. So some advantages are, so the whole point of this is to get started. So you don't need to wait for the full design. You just want to set up some kind of monitoring on some part of the system to be able to start some detecting things and start learning about AWS services and start learning about the types of attacks relevant to that particular system. A lot of the time I see security teams get stuck because they want to design the whole, all singing, all dancing security monitoring solution, and they want to build the perfect thing, and it never gets off the ground. And so this approach is still exciting. It still gets people infused with new services, new cloud technologies, and they don't get stuck behind doing a whole big monolithic security monitoring design. You can come back to that and do that later. The other thing I kind of mentioned it already is that often security do not talk to development teams, and there's a big divide and a big sort of culture gap and a language gap. This type of approach really helps to bring those two teams together, upskill your security team so they start speaking the same language, they start understanding the terminology of the tools and how they might how those AWS tools integrate with some of the technologies that your developers are already using. Once people are speaking the same language and both teams are getting excited about new capabilities, it just makes things so much easier and so much enjoyable to work with. So these native services, they are relatively low cost. So you can turn them on, turn them off. There's free trials associated with them. Maybe you still want to implement a SIEM. You still got a whole security operations technology stack that you want to build, but you're not quite there yet. So this is kind of a quick, low-cost way of doing some monitoring without having to design and deploy a full security operations center technology stack. So some disadvantages here. You do absolutely need a foundation knowledge of AWS services, and you do need people who are willing to get stuck in, get in the console, play around with the tools, understand how they work, learn about them. There are so many tools. We've only mentioned a few here today, some of our core foundational security services, but there are many, many, many more. And so having that culture, or having people in the team who want to learn about all the tools and how they all fit together, is super important. And having that, I would say, is a prerequisite to running this type of technique. That's the links to the MITRE ATT&CK library. So there's some rules in there, pre-canned. So if you want to detect things in your CloudTrail logs for MITRE, then there's a whole rule set there for you to implement alongside the guard duty one, which I've already shown. And that is it. I think we've got 7 minutes for questions now. So yeah.
We do. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end your slides here. Well, my head's really close to the camera, so I'll back up a little bit. That was great. That was a ton of information. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for breaking it down and presenting that to our WiCyS members and the audience that were able to join us here today. So that was really exciting. So we have a couple questions that came in, and I just want to take a moment now for the audience. You've received a lot of information. You're processing this information, but post your questions in the chat area at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those live right here, right now, with the remaining 6 minutes that we have. So we're going to make the most of our time. And Rebecca, a question came in that was asking, can this approach be used for other technology stacks, not just AWS?
Yes, absolutely. So the wonderful thing about this approach is, obviously I've talked about AWS. That's where I work. That's my expertise. If you're using Azure, if you're wanting to enhance your monitoring capability on premise, then you could absolutely use the MITRE ATT&CK framework and this kind of one application, one technique approach for any system that you wanted.
Okay, great. Great. And a question did come in, but it's more of a statement. It says, thank you, great session, which we all knew. The reviews are also coming in, and they're all like 5 stars. So way to go, Rebecca. Would you recommend going through this process for the whole attack matrix?
Maybe. So yes and no. I think probably I'm leaning towards no. So first of all, you don't need to use the whole attack matrix. The whole of the matrix won't even be relevant to your system. So making sure that you cross out all the ones, all the techniques, and all the tactics that had nothing to do with your system, and get rid of those first of all. The second thing is, I think what you will find is a lot of especially the security controls and detection mechanisms are the same for nearly all the techniques. So I would suggest maybe pick at least one technique from each of the tactics that's relevant to your system, go through that once, check, have a look through some of the others, and you probably could stop there. Like, I think you would have a good comprehensive logging and monitoring design after that process. Now, I would, this is always iterative. So as new systems come online, new things have been designed, then absolutely go through this process with a new technique, just to kind of enthuse people again. I wouldn't say you'd need to do the whole matrix. I think that's probably overkill and a bit overwhelming.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Let me see here. Oh, another comment came in. I just want to say thank you, Rebecca. You're amazing. Okay. And then a question that came in is, as a current Amazon Ops Tech IT Level 3 associate trying to learn more about AWS to move up in the company in offensive security, what programs from this session would you highly recommend for someone to start learning Lambda to focus on first?
Oh, okay, that's a big question. I'm going to break it down. Okay. So learning Lambda as a technology, best recommendation, get in the console, spin up a Lambda. There's some lots of sample code on the internet around, and there's even sample code in the console itself. Turn on Lambda, play around with the settings, understand the service first of all. In terms of offensive security, so I guess you're talking about offensive security in general, and kind of pen testing, I suppose you're kind of thinking about here. So I would suggest maybe having a look at some of the pen testing courses that are available online. There's also loads and loads of free resources in terms of like learning how to hack. So if you want to learn how to hack, there's Hack the Box, there's Over the Wire, there's a whole bunch of resources around practicing offensive security on different technologies. So I'd kind of maybe do them independently and then work out whether you can join them up.
Great. For tools like CloudTrail and CloudWatch, are there add-ons there to just attach to AWS, or would you have to export AWS logs and put them in the other software? Great talk, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you want to ingest CloudTrail, CloudWatch logs, to analyze them, we have a service called OpenSearch. You can ingest lots of AWS logs into that capability. So OpenSearch is based on the ELK stack, if you're familiar with that, which is a log analytics capability. It's your choice. Like, you don't have to. You can put them into native tooling, use CloudTrail Lake, use OpenSearch, use the CloudWatch dashboards. You can probably get by with that. If you finding that's not enough, or it's not flexible enough for you, then I would highly recommend reaching out to one of our partners and utilizing one of the services that integrates directly with us. Like, for example, something like Splunk Cloud, it very seamlessly integrates with AWS and all of the native logging services. There's really not much stuff there to turn on to implement that integration.
Okay, great, good to know. Can Lambda be used in the AWS free account?
I would have to double check that. I think it's highly likely that if you're using a free tier on AWS, you can spin up one Lambda with a sample code and run it. I don't see a reason why that would take you beyond the free tier, but I'm not 100% about that. I'd have to check.
All right, great. And one more question. We have one more minute, one more question. Does doing the simulation on a VM make any difference as to what you can get using a live system?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. So I'm going to guess that you're talking about doing some threat modeling on a test system versus a live system, I think.
I would presume that's, yeah.
So I think if you're talking about understanding what logging capabilities and what security controls you want to implement, you should absolutely test that out in a virtual environment first. I'd say the only difference between a test environment and a live system is the intent of the attacker. So obviously, in general, attackers are not going after the test systems unless there's a route into production from there. They're generally going after the live system, and if your test environment isn't the same as production, then this kind of goes out the window too, because you can't, if you're running a simulation on an environment that doesn't represent your production environment, then it's not going to work, and you're probably going to have to do this just on your live system for it to be effective. Okay. I hope I've answered that. I'm not quite sure what you meant.
Well, if this individual that asked this question wants any further information, you could reach out to info@WiCyS.org, and we could certainly relay that question over to you, Rebecca, and make the introduction for you to explain it further.
Perfect.
So, yes. So anyone that joined us today, please email info@WiCyS.org if you have any further questions. I know Rebecca shared a ton of information. It was so great having you, Rebecca. I hope that we get a chance to meet in real life and hopefully get you out to the WiCyS conference. But I really appreciate everyone that took the time and attention to share your afternoon with us. And with that, it is a wrap. So enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. We'll sync up.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you all. Bye.